Heretic was written and directed by Brian Woods and Scott Beck, who co-wrote A Quiet Place, and they're directing this movie. They previously directed 65 last year. And in this movie, two Mormon women, they are going house to house trying to convert people and such, and they wind up coming across Hugh Grant's character, who is very skeptical. However, they soon realize that he's more dangerous than they realize, and now they have to try to find a way out of his house. So this was a movie I was kind of intrigued by, mainly just because of the involvement of A24 and Hugh Grant. Now, I usually really like A24's movies, and anytime to do a horror movie, I'm always on board. Hugh Grant, obviously, I'm not really the biggest fan of him, but I'm actually really a fan of his career as of late. Ever since Paddington 2, weirdly enough, I feel like he's definitely gotten a lot of bit of a resurgence in his career, and I actually really enjoy a lot of his performances now, especially as of late. So I was definitely curious to see what he would be like, especially in a horror movie, especially in a villain role. So I went and saw this movie, and for the most part, I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was a very interesting movie, definitely very intense, very intriguing and such, but definitely a movie that kind of made me think after a while. So let's start with the positives. Hugh Grant in this movie is fantastic. I thought he was really good. You definitely understand where his character is coming from throughout the entire movie. At the same time, you kind of like want to believe a lot of the things he does say in this movie, and it's definitely very interesting, very uncomfortable at the same time. Like, he tries to use some of that charm that he uses in a lot of his romantic leads and such, and I feel like that's very effective, kind of like, subverting his own career in some way. It's like, I do think his character is very fascinating, not just how he behaves, but also the way he says his words. It's like, you definitely kind of understand where he's coming from. I feel like a good villain makes you understand where they're coming from, but not necessarily root for them. The two female leads in this movie, Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, I thought they did a really good job. I liked their relationship throughout the entire movie. I thought their chemistry was really well done. I also kind of like their arcs in this movie, where it's like, you definitely tell one is kind of skeptical, but the other one is very not skeptical in any way. I do feel like you definitely believe their characters and like where they're coming from and such. I do think they work really well against Hugh Grant in this movie. Meanwhile, this movie is very tension filled, like particularly in the first, probably in the second half, or maybe also throughout the entire movie actually. But definitely in the second half, when you kind of like get to know like what's going on, like what's really happening in this movie and such, there are definitely some very tension filled moments, not just like stuff happening, but stuff being said. It's just very uncomfortable at times. But then again, there's also some very uncomfortable moments where you kind of want to laugh during this movie. A lot of the things that Hugh Grant talks about in this movie kind of made me want to laugh a few times, but not because it was like bad or anything, but like you kind of have no reason but to laugh. It kind of equated to something that M. Night Shyamalan would do. I feel like if this was done by M. Night Shyamalan, some of the things that he would be talking about and some of the analogies he was using would be kind of odd. Like, he mentions board games and fast food throughout this conversation that they have, and that is very, it feels very Shyamalan-y, but it still kind of works in what they're trying to go for. I do also like the design of the house itself, like particularly before they really get into the crazy stuff in the second half of the movie. Also, the movie does get pretty unpredictable at times. The movie, like, I kind of thought, okay, this is the direction it's going to go in, and it's like, okay, I kind of know what's going to happen from this point forward. And thankfully, I didn't. I like it when a movie can surprise me. What happened to movies that can surprise you? I really feel like this movie kind of just caught me off guard a few times, especially like some of the twists with the characters and such. And again, back to the house itself, I do like it when thrillers kind of like have like one location and they use the location itself very effectively, and I feel like Heretic does that really well. And I also feel like the conversations that this movie talks about, particularly about power beliefs, is there like, should you believe, should you not believe? I feel like it's handled in a very respectful way, where you can see like, oh, this is where this person comes from and how they view the world and such. And it doesn't really belittle anybody. Like, obviously Hugh Grant's saying like all these things, but it's like, you understand where he's coming from, and you understand like where these two girls are coming from. It's like, okay, you understand where they're coming from and such. And the movie doesn't like try to say, one way is better than the other, but here's where we kind of lie with this. I do feel like it's very interesting in that way. But let's talk about a couple of things I don't like about this movie. First off, there's like one storyline that's kind of briefly brought into the movie at some point around the middle of the movie. It involves someone from the girls', lives and such, goes searching for them, and then it literally just disappears. I'm like, okay, where's this story going to go? Oh, that's it. Well, okay then. In The Shining, at least there was a reason why Dick Halloran randomly appears in the movie, because he comes back and he's actually important to the plot later on. But this movie, it just feels kind of unimportant. And also, as much as I like the house design itself and how they kind of use the house at times, there was also a part of me that was a little disappointed in how they kind of shot the movie at times, particularly in the second half, which, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's a little too dark for me, And I probably just equate that to like the design of the house, and probably just like, oh, because of where they are, there's probably no windows and such, which may be a spoiler. So I feel like kind of like what's behind the doors at first was a little disappointing, but like when you kind of like go through the house and such, like, okay, I'm definitely back on board a little bit. So it definitely kind of takes a moment to make you kind of like, it kind of takes a moment to, tamper your expectations a bit, because it will bring them back. So, Heretic, I think, is a very solid movie overall. The acting is very well done. It is very tension filled. The moments where it can be funny are actually surprisingly well done. The conversations are very interesting. It can be unpredictable at times. The design of the house is very interesting as well. And even though I don't really like some of the storylines and some of the cinematography, particularly in the second half of the movie, I would still recommend this movie. Especially if you're an A24 fan, especially if you're a fan of Hugh Grant's Renaissance these days. I feel like this is kind of an interesting movie to look at, especially if you kind of have like, I don't want to say you're against, what you believe in such, or against various forms of faith and such. I do think there's a very interesting conversation with this movie, just as long as you can kind of see things from both sides. I will give Heretic 3 out of 4 stars. See it. So, what's your favorite Hugh Grant movie? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat, and stay safe.